Bonjour à tous ceux qui nous rejoignent pour cette sixième et avant-dernière journée des rencontres du développement durable, des premières rencontres du développement durable, co-organisées aujourd'hui par l'Institut Open Diplomacy avec KEDGE Business School. Nous avons la chance de recevoir ce matin Rodolfo Lassi, qui a été vice-ministre de l'Environnement au Mexique et qui occupe aujourd'hui la fonction essentielle de directeur de l'environnement à l'OCDE, l'Organisation pour la coopération et le développement économique. Cet échange va se dérouler en anglais, mais vous pouvez continuer à poser vos questions à notre équipe sur la page live de l'événement. Mr. Lassi, I'm very pleased to welcome you and host you on that live. Very much proud of the fact that the OECD is an institutional partner of the Rencontres du Développement Durable. I would like to speak in Spanish with you, but I'm not able to, and still I'm happy to host you. Welcome.
Well, good morning. I suppose that you can hear me.
It's perfect. The connection is working. We are proud to host you. We had one of your former colleagues on the first day, Mrs. Ramos, who was the chief of staff of the OECD, as well as the G20 Sherpa of your institution. We will talk about that institutional role of the OECD within the international system. But to start with, I'd like to focus more on the role of the OECD today. The OECD is one of the most important institutions at the global stage to measure economic progress and to advise governments in leading public policies. Your baseline is better policies for better lives, and we are now experiencing a crisis that makes it so hard to live. We have passed the threshold of 1 million deaths of the coronavirus at the global stage. What are the toolbox? What is the toolbox that the OECD has advised to the government of the world to deal with that crisis from a health perspective, of course, but more globally from an economic point of view?
Well, I have to say that tracking different economic instruments. By the way, we track 3,600 economic instruments like taxes, subsidies, economic policies that are only worldwide, but also in my directorate, all the instruments that are linked to environmental issues like climate change, biodiversity, and in this specific case, with the pandemic.
Yeah, and maybe,
Sorry,
Mr. Lassi, could you let us...
I'm losing the connection of my voice.
Excuse me, can you tell that again? I think we have a trouble connecting with you. We will call you very shortly back with a number that you can use to discuss smoothly with us. Your picture will be on the screen, so my team behind the scene will call you so that we make sure we have this discussion to understand what is at stake with the OECD. Et en attendant que nous arrivions à reconnecter Monsieur Lassi correctement pour pouvoir profiter de toute son expérience en tant qu'ancien ministre de l'Environnement du Mexique et en tant que directeur de l'OCDE chargé des questions environnementales, je vous invite déjà à poser toutes vos questions sur la façon dont cette crise coronavirus, évidemment, peut éventuellement ralentir la transition écologique et solidaire que nous menons à bien. Évidemment, vos questions seront prises en compte de sorte que nous puissions reconnecter avec Monsieur Lassi. Sir, I guess we are fine now. Is the connection working with you?
Now it's working.
Excellent. That's a good news. Amid the crisis, that's a good news. Well, my question was, what is the toolbox that the OECD has put forward to the government to deal with that crisis? And especially since you're the director for the environment at the OECD, what is at stake in dealing with that crisis, which has a health perspective, which has a strong economic and social stake, but still can make it harder to deal with the next crisis, which is about the environment? How do you deal with that?
Well, I was explaining that we are tracking 36,000 different economic instruments worldwide. Yes. Because, well, this is an international economic organization, and it's It's a tool, a set of databases that we use to analyze the situation according with the actual circumstances. And we have to recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic is inextricably intertwined with global environmental issues such as biodiversity loss or climate change, but also with air and water pollution and waste management, both in terms of its origin and the implications in general terms for environmental outcomes. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is directly related with the future well-being of societies around the world. So the economic stimulus packages and recovery plans that governments are now putting in place have the potential to be green recovery, such as the recovery can be defined or we can understand as green recovery as the potential to create opportunities for income with the green businesses, creating green jobs, new jobs, and of course, creating wealth, and at the same time, accelerate action on medium and long-term environmental goals as the Paris Agreement.
And so to make it very concrete and clear to those who hear us and are not familiar with the OECD work, you've explained us that the OECD works as a brain plugged on many, many datas around the world to look at how the economy works. Could you tell us what is the data you're tracking to see whether the crisis management, the economic recovery we're getting in, is making sure that we follow the path of the 2030 agenda, is in line with the SDGs? What is the most important indicator, index that you use to make sure we are going the right way?
Well, first, we are measuring, of course, carbon intensity to see if our countries are decoupling emissions from economic growth. In general, that is happening among OECD countries. Right. But now that we are in this COVID-19 pandemics, we are measuring and gathering, of course, many information related with the economic packages. We did recently a survey to see how these economic recovery packages, some of them, of course, are long-term or medium-term programs, are aligned with these principles of global environmental regimes.
That is very interesting. You're telling us that you're measuring the intensity of carbon emissions within growth, meaning we aim at growth, but we decrease the carbon intensity. Who is the country? What is the country that is making its best in that context at the OECD level? The OECD is not a global organization; it's an organization with 36 member states. Who is the champion of that transition of a greener growth?
Well, I have to say that it's Switzerland, Sweden, Ireland, France, Denmark. So those are the countries who are performing better. And of course, there are others that are not as green as we can expect, but are taking different pathways to be more sustainable.
And how could you share? How could you address our citizens in France to intensify that effort? You've said we are going the right way, but we are not getting fast enough. How could we make sure, as citizens, as consumers, as workers, that our economy is going faster in that direction of a low carbon intensity growth?
Well, I think that we have to put two examples that are relevant in our lives, in our daily lives, or that could be relevant in the new normal. Aviation industry. Let me put that example first.
Yep.
We are not, in fact, putting a price in the carbon emissions of the airplane tickets. We are measuring what we call effective carbon rates to see if carbon pricing in different sectors are working efficiently or even are in place. And what we are seeing is that those cheap tickets that we love, cheap tickets that allow us to go for holidays during the summer, or that give us the opportunity to, of course, be active or intensively active before the pandemic, to do businesses or to of course, increase the free trade activities, are free of charge when we talk about environmental implications. So all these environmental externalities, especially climate externalities, are not internalized in the cost of the ticket.
That's an interesting point. And let me, if I may, rephrase it, not because it wasn't clear, but to make sure that every citizen has a clear idea of what you mean by internalizing that environment cost in the ticket. It means paying the carbon that you expend in traveling. And we usually know that taking the plane once a year to go across the Atlantic, maybe visiting any friends in Canada or getting back to Mexico in a family, is equivalent of riding a car every single day for an hour. So that's very important to make sure that the price of the planet is the price of oil you spend in riding your car, or the ticket of plane you purchase. And that's measuring that the OECD is measuring that cost, and it's helping governments in designing policies to make sure that carbon price, the planet cost, is in every market. And you usually advise the G20 as the global forum for leadership at the most important level every year since 2008, since the global financial crisis. The G20 is happening very soon under the presidency of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is obviously a country that is driven by the oil industry. So as the OECD, how do you feed that G20? How do you make recommendation to this very special G20, which has to deal with the global health crisis, but still has to look forward and to steer forward throughout the transition? What is the recommendation of the OECD in that context this year?
You hear me? Well, I couldn't hear in the last part of...
Sir, I'll repeat the question to make sure you're on stage with us. The OECD has kept since 12 years, has played a role for the last 12 years to advise the G20 on making decisions for the global economy, right? And this year, the G20 is happening in 2 weeks in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is an oil-driven economy and a very carbon-intense industry. What are the recommendations that you make in that very specific year of global crisis for health issues to make sure that the G20 leaders keep steering into the right direction of the transition?
Well, we did 3 recommendations. One is related to fossil fuel subsidies. Yes. Because fossil fuel subsidies are, of course, as I was explaining, in the aviation industry, but also in maritime, for example, transportation, are encouraging dirty industries, dirty activities. So we have to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, doing a fiscal reform. The second recommendations we did is related with closing the carbon cycle using new technologies. One specific technology is carbon capture, use and storage in heavy industries. We developed a specific paper on enabling policies to really close the carbon cycle in the core of the climate problem that are, of course, heavy industries' greenhouse gas emissions. And the third recommendation we did is mainly related of avoid locking decisions during the recovery phase, because it is true that if we promote an energy transition to more cleaner options, to more low carbon technologies, resilient technologies, we cannot, of course, prolong or extend the life of industries that are high emitters. So those are our main recommendations to the G20. And we were talking with them about the energy fiscal reforms, and also more investments in innovation, especially in technologies that we know that can help during the recovery phase in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas industry.
Thank you, Mr. Lassie. I remind to our public that you're the Director for the Environment at the OECD, one of the institutional partners of this Rencontres du Développement Durable, co-organized today along with KEDGE Business School. And I would like to take away two lessons from what you just said and the recommendations you're carrying out to the G20. The fossil fuel subsidies, that is a stop we need to put, because it's meaningless to have public money getting to fuel, if I may, the oil industry. That is a recommendation that young generations have made and put forward within the G20 and the G7 for long years. And last year, when the Open Diplomacy Institute was hosting the Youth 7 in Paris that we closed at the OECD, and one of the most important recommendations we made to the G7 leaders was exactly about that. And you go to the next G20 summit very soon, please carry on the message that the young generation from across the globe is expected very bold measures on that stop on fossil fuel subsidies. And the second thing I'd like to point out, on top of what our fellow delegates to the Y20 will say, I mean Rose, Benoît and Constance, who will speak along this Rencontres du Développement Durable about their recommendations to the G20 leaders. There is another thing that the encounters can make along with the OECD, is to speak about this carbon cycle you've pointed out as the second recommendations you've presented. We are speaking today all about that, all about the way you reuse your own energy, and we will have a specific roundtable about the transition within the transport sector early this afternoon. Mr. Lassie, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of our Open Diplomacy Institute and co-organizer today, KEDGE Business School, for the support of the OECD and for your presence today. I hope the connection was not too bad, and we will share this conversation with all citizens who are interested in the international framework you're guiding through. And I'll switch back into French pour continuer d'organiser cette journée préparée avec KEDGE Business School. Le CDE était représenté aujourd'hui par Rodolphe Lassie. Nous allons continuer à réfléchir à l'ensemble de ces sujets. Évidemment, au transport, on en parlait à l'instant avec Rodolphe Lassie, ce sera l'objet de notre table ronde du début de l'après-midi, mais aussi de l'agriculture. C'était un point soulevé dans l'ouverture par Bérangère Rabat, l'agriculture étant un des secteurs industriels, économiques plutôt les plus importants dans la crise climatique, puisqu'elle représente entre 15 et 18% des émissions de gaz à effet de serre. On va parler d'économie circulaire tout au long de la journée, et j'aurai le plaisir de partager la modération de ce jour avec un ami qui nous aide beaucoup, qui est non seulement un excellent expert de l'économie circulaire, mais aussi un acteur direct du sujet. Je parle de Pierre-Emmanuel Saint-Esprit, qui est le directeur général de ZAC, une compagnie d'économie circulaire spécialisée dans le recyclage des produits électroniques, produits qui sont particulièrement difficiles à réintégrer dans notre économie une fois leur fin de vie arrivée à temps. Je vous donne rendez-vous tout de suite pour cette 6e et avant-dernière journée des Rencontres du Développement Durable, co-organisée aujourd'hui avec KEDGE Business School.